November 1918. The ships of the victors crowd the harbor at Constantinople after World War I. From the palace of a weak and corrupt sultan, there comes no opposition. Turks bowing to Mecca accept their fate.
The end of the First World War and the fall of the once mighty Ottoman Empire.
A much smaller and more homogeneous land which, with leadership, may become a nation.
It's nearly 100 years since those tumultuous events. That smaller, more homogeneous land did become a nation, Turkey. But what kind of nation is it? Where does it belong? This is The Inquiry, and I'm Chris Morris. I used to live in Turkey, a wonderful, complex, fascinating place. Back then, more than a decade ago, it seemed clear that Turks saw their future as Europeans. Their application to join the European Union was slowly progressing, and there was real enthusiasm for the EU. Now it seems something's changed. That's why this week we're asking, does Turkey still want to join the EU?
Part 1. A long engagement. For Turkey, historically, the idea of a union in Europe was kind of part of the founding logic of the secular republic.
Aykan Erdemir is our first expert witness, a former member of the Turkish parliament, and he can help us understand how we got to this point in relations between Turkey and Europe.
Going back to the late 1940s, Turkish delegations saw themselves as architects, as visionaries of the Europe of the future.
Their inspiration was Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of the modern republic, described in this CBS film as the Incredible Turk.
His fantastic dream is not of empire or conquest, but of creating a democratic Turkey, a new kind of Turk in his lifetime.
In the 1920s, he launched an extraordinary transformation, taking his impoverished new country by the scruff of the neck and forcing it to change. Being modern meant being Western, looking towards Europe. The Latin alphabet was adopted, Western dress was introduced, and wearing the fez was banned.
To Kemal, this headgear, the fez, symbolizes Turkey's Oriental fatalism and ignorance. He will abolish it.
European culture and classical music were imported, and in 1924 the Islamic Caliphate was abolished. In an instinctively conservative Muslim country, Aykan Erdemir says, it was a massive shock to the system.
Mustafa Kemal Ataturk had a clear vision to orient the country toward the West, toward Western values, science, secularism, rights and freedoms, gender equality. And this clear vision right from the very start is kind of the DNA of the secular Turkish Republic.
Of course, none of it meant Turkey became a fully functioning democracy overnight. It was a pretty rocky road. But when the Cold War divided Europe, it became clear which side Turkey was on. In 1952, it joined NATO, and 7 years later, it applied for associate membership of the European Economic Community.
Turkey saw the West as a safe harbor. Turkey thought that its territorial integrity, its secular republic, its values, as well as future could best be secured under the Western umbrella.
But that meant that the overhaul of Turkish society had to continue. At times, progress was slow or non-existent. Old habits died hard. But in 1987, Turkey applied for full membership of what we now call the European Union. And gradually, Aykan Erdemir argues, the country began to change even more.
Turkey managed to tackle very painful issues such as torture, ill treatment of detainees and prisoners, capital punishment, media freedom issues, civil society and religious freedoms issues, minority rights.
In 1995, Turkey joined the EU's customs union.
There were celebrations in the capital, there were fireworks.
But still, it wasn't easy. Some reforms were passed on paper but ignored in practice. As the 21st century dawned, it was pretty clear that more needed to be done.
The Turkish parliament worked late-night shifts. There was genuine belief in Turkey that things would move forward. And back then, the main sentiment was that this had more to do with Turkey doing its homework.
But there was always a suspicion that handing your homework in on time was never quite enough. Did the EU really want Turkey, or was it just playing games?
We were beginning to feel that no matter how hard Turkey tried, Turkey's membership bid could be blocked either by xenophobes or populists or anti-Muslim groups in the European Union. But nevertheless, we believe that the best way to overcome that opposition in the EU was to prove to our EU counterparts that Turkey was capable of reform.
In the end, it took a remarkable, controversial politician to achieve that goal. To the obvious discomfort of Turkey's pro-Western secular elite, he was an Islamist from the wrong side of the tracks, who became the country's most important leader since Ataturk. First Prime Minister and now President, Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
Part 2. A sour taste.
He was the man who convinced the European Union to open full membership talks with Turkey. He's an incredibly charismatic figure.
Amberin Zaman, our second witness, was The Economist's Turkey correspondent for 16 years before leaving the country in 2015.
The sort of language he used, the imagery he evoked, I found myself writing a column saying that I was ready to join any jihad that he launched. I was so sort of spellbound by him.
A landslide in Turkish politics. A new political party and its leader, Tayyip Erdogan, have swept away the weakness of corrupt coalitions.
After Tayyip Erdogan's first triumphant election victory in 2002, he became the darling of Turkey's conservative religious majority, and for a while he could do no wrong. Western leaders saw him as a courageous reformer, while at home he reached out to the Kurds and others who'd never before felt they had a stake in the system.
He was Turkey's great white hope then. He lifted millions of Turks out of poverty and gave them access to good roads, to education.
And he pursued the goal of EU accession with vigour. Formal membership negotiations finally began in 2005. To his friends in the West, Tayyip Erdogan was living proof that Islam and democracy could coexist.
I think there was a time where he did see that this could lead to perhaps broader Western acceptance of, let's say, Muslim politicians, people who clearly identified themselves as Muslims, being part of a democratic process, indeed leading a democratic process in the countries that they governed.
He also clipped the wings of the Turkish military, which had always had huge influence over civilian life and politics. Another welcome reform? Or was an Islamist leader chipping away at the secular system which the army had sworn to protect? Criticism of Erdogan began to grow. The political winds in Europe also began to change. A new generation of conservative leaders, Angela Merkel in Germany, Nicolas Sarkozy in France, openly questioned whether Turkey belonged in the EU. The presence of Turkish troops in Cyprus, now an EU member, didn't help matters. Membership talks faltered, and Erdogan's mood began to darken.
People like Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy made it so clear to Turkey that regardless of what they did, whether they stood on their heads or made peace with the Kurds or pushed on Cyprus, they would still not be admitted. And as the Turkish people, and certainly Tayyip Erdogan saw it, this was mainly because Turkey is a Muslim country. And I think that left a very sour taste in everybody's mouths.
Erdogan himself, quick to take offence, seemed to view it all as a personal insult, a character flaw that had been there from the start.
He's very thin-skinned, very intolerant of any kind of criticism. When I first interviewed him, he apparently went through my profile of him in The Economist, a sort of word for word and drew bold red lines through the bits he didn't like. And when I met him soon after, having written a rather favourable piece about his wife, he sort of said, well, why do you never write anything nice about me, Amber Zaman?
As president, Erdogan began to sound permanently annoyed with just about everything, complaining about European support for terrorism, about a lack of respect for Turkey's sacrifice in hosting millions of Syrian refugees.
There's a very long list of things that Turkey remains quite upset about that have compounded this feeling that the Europeans are basically just not sincere in their dealings with Turkey.
In 2013, growing tensions within Turkey burst into the open. A campaign to protect a green space at Gezi Park in the heart of Istanbul grew into a series of anti-government protests, which the authorities suppressed with considerable force. Erdogan condemned the protesters, who were broadly pro-European, as traitors and provocateurs. 2 years later, he abandoned a peace process with the Kurdish rebel movement, the PKK, and a brutal civil war has now resumed. I wonder if things could have happened differently. If the EU had offered Erdogan more encouragement, would his policies at home have been more restrained?
I think that he would have had far less room for manoeuvre if the EU talks had gone on track, and Turkey would have, against his will even perhaps, progressed in that direction. There's no question of that.
Instead, things went from bad to worse. There's been a series of horrific bomb attacks in Turkish cities, the latest just this weekend. And earlier this year, there was the enormous shock of an attempted but failed military coup. President Erdogan barely escaped arrest and possible assassination. Parliament was bombed, people were killed in the street, but the response from the EU seemed to be rather muted.
He keeps reminding European leaders that nobody came to Turkey to wave the flag and say, hey, we're here, we're with you, we're behind you. All of that made him deeply upset.
And now Erdogan's anti-EU rhetoric has intensified, and a crackdown on government opponents has seen tens of thousands of people arrested. The country is deeply divided, and the EU has become part of that mix. But Amber Zaman says the divisions have always been there.
There are very, very deep fault lines in the society, a society that was polarised long before Erdogan appeared on the scene.
So when it comes to the EU, what do the people now think?
Part 3. The end of the affair?
Depends on how you define Turkey.
Our third witness is Senem Aydin Düzgit from Sabancı University in Istanbul. She's an expert on the relationship between Turkey and the EU, so I asked her our question straight out. Does Turkey still want to join?
If you're talking about the governing party, I would say no. If you're asking about the people, I would say half and half. If you ask about the main opposition, I would say yes. So it depends on whose Turkey we're talking about, since we're dealing with such a divided and polarised country.
Well, what do the opinion polls say about enthusiasm for the EU?
Last year it was about as low as 38%, according to the Eurobarometer data of the European Commission, which is much lower than what we had back in the first half of 2000s, when the range was between 65 and 75%.
So we now at, if you like, one of the lowest points ever?
Yes, I think so. We're basically at a point in which a suspension of relationships could be possible.
Given the fact that things have got so bad, it's actually quite surprising that roughly 40% of people are still in favour. But no one, Senem says, wants their country to become a perpetual second-class citizen, written off as too big, too poor and too Muslim.
Many people believed that the European Union was a Christian project, which always held double standards towards Turkey.
What's more, Turkey's been forced to sit in the EU's waiting room and watch other countries jumping the queue. Some of them have seemed ill-prepared for EU membership themselves.
This is not how it treated the other countries, including Greece, of course, Turkey's neighbor, or countries of Central and Eastern Europe, like Bulgaria, Romania, etc., that are never really perceived as fully democratic or economically with good standards, but still accepted as members. This is a sentiment across all of the Turkish public, and it is a strong one.
So this is the Turkish version of Euroscepticism, and it's been filtering into popular culture for quite a while.
There was a famous TV series of The Valley of the Wolves that did play into that sort of skepticism or fear that the West or the Westerners are kind of an enemy that tries to inflict terror in Turkey and that kind of story.
All of this has an effect. It reinforces perceptions. But these days, of course, the EU is facing an identity crisis of its own, under pressure economically, fragmenting politically. Perhaps EU membership is no longer the glittering prize for Turkey that it once appeared to be.
What's been happening in the EU, independent of Turkey, have also had an impact on these perceptions, negative perceptions, especially since the unfolding of the Euro crisis from about 2008 and 2009 onwards, because it increased the perception in Turkey, as elsewhere in the world, that the European Union was now a declining power, that even its own member states wanted to exit the EU.
And Tayyip Erdogan has essentially built on that by increasingly saying, we don't need the EU, we can go it alone. Turkey's strong enough, Turkey's powerful enough.
It sort of led to a sense of perhaps false superiority, that we're better than Europe or we're better than the West.
It has at least got people thinking. If not the EU, then what?
Part 4. Looking the other way.
Surely there's a flirtation going on.
Turkey is fluttering its eyelids in various directions. It wants to send a message that it does have other options.
Turkey could very well continue its life without being a EU member.
This is Sinan Ulgen, the chairman of the Centre for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies in Istanbul, and our fourth witness. He points out that Tayyip Erdogan has some pretty grandiose alternatives to the EU. For one thing, he's constantly harking back to the glory days of the Ottoman Empire.
Turkey is viewed as a country that has to leverage its past historical ties, its Ottoman heritage, and therefore should start to act more independently of its ties to Europe and more as a regional power, reminiscent of the role that it played back in the Ottoman days. Part of the Islamic world, potentially a leader of the Islamic world.
In fact, the president has gone even further, floating the idea of joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which groups countries in Central Asia together. But it's dominated by Russia and China, and it would mark a radical change of direction for Turkey. So is this a serious proposition?
At most, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization could potentially be an alternative to NATO, not the EU. And there's no discussion in Turkey about exiting NATO. So in that sense, the alternative that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization could provide is really an unrealistic assumption. And I would argue that it's mostly come about as a reaction.
In other words, President Erdogan is warning Europe not to take Turkey for granted. Look at all my new friends. Vladimir Putin, for instance. The Russian president was quick to support Erdogan in the aftermath of this year's failed coup. But Turkey's relationship with its huge northern neighbour has always been something of a mixed bag.
The first nuclear power plant in Turkey is being built by Russia. Then there are a number of pipeline projects. So these are projects that are of mutual interest. But there will always be a limit to the strategic rapprochement between Turkey and Russia. Turkey, for instance, has been critical and never accepted the annexation of Crimea by Russia. Syria is another area where the two governments are certainly not on the same wavelength.
And Syria is a tragic reminder of the mess Turkey faces when it peers across its eastern borders. There's also Iraq and Iran, as well as the running sore of the Kurdish conflict spilling into other countries. For the moment, things could hardly be worse in the Middle East. And that's another reason why Sinan Ulgun thinks Turkey will continue to look west, towards Europe. Because wherever else it looks, the numbers don't quite add up.
Turkey will not be able to find an alternative that provides such a rich network of economic, political, social, cultural benefits as its relationship with the EU. So that's the dilemma. 49% of Turkey's total exports are to the EU. 72% of foreign direct investment that Turkey attracts is from the EU. When you look at the numbers from Russia and China and Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan and so on, they pale in comparison.
So if Turkey's stuck with the EU in one form or another, is there a different model out there for a new kind of relationship?
We've got our country back!
Well, one thing has certainly changed this year. How much difference do you think the Brexit referendum and the subsequent idea of Britain leaving the European Union, how much difference will that make for Turkey? Because you now have another major European power that is soon going to be looking in from the outside.
Potentially, this could make quite a big difference, because the quest on the UK side to find and to negotiate a new relationship with Europe is in many ways very similar to Turkey's efforts. There are indeed a number of overlapping themes in terms of how the two countries will start to view and structure their relationship with Europe in the future.
So, where does that leave our question? Does Turkey still want to join the EU? From the evidence we've gathered, the answer seems to be no, not at the moment. Under current circumstances, Turkey no longer wants to join. Politics can change, though, sometimes abruptly, and the British vote to leave the EU could end up rewriting the rules of the game. That may give Turkey an opportunity to establish its own new relationship with the EU, not as a full member, but not as a second-class citizen either. This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Chris Morris, and produced in London by Julia Ross. It was mixed by James Beard. You can get in touch via the World Service Facebook page or on Twitter. We're at BBC The Inquiry.